Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Stay Informed. We're your host.
Hi, I'm Tom.
And I'm Jessica. Today, we'll be discussing a hot topic, bias in AI. Lately, you can't open an industry publication without seeing something about bias, and there's a lively debate about AI's role. Will it increase or decrease bias? So, Tom, you spent quite a bit of time in the fair lending space with your time with CFPB. Which side of the debate do you fall on? Does AI increase or does it decrease bias in lending?
I'm a lawyer, so I have to give both sides of the answer. On the one hand, I think right now AI is really at risk of being a force multiplier for bias. But long term, I think AI can be a solution really to reduce bias in lending and in other industries, as well as in the way we interact with each other as people.
Force multiplier, yeah, that sounds a little scary. Please explain.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so one of the things that AI is based on is data. And the data that we have in this world and a lot of the services we use and a lot of the models we build is not neutral. You think about credit reports, there are 50 million people who are not in credit reports. A lot of the data that are used to build models also come from wealthier people. It just turns out that wealthier people on the internet and elsewhere have just a bigger footprint, and there's more data about them. So one of the challenges when you're thinking about bias is data. Another example, there's a famous example from Amazon. They tried to build a model to hire engineers, and they relied on their own employees who were predominantly males. So guess what happened?
They hired more males.
You got it. You got it. So another problem is, designing it, how you design the model. And if you have models which weigh certain values more than others, you can have problems. So, for example, there are models to look at recidivism in going back to jail, and they look at variables such as, do you live in poor areas, or do you know people with arrest records? Well, what's going to happen is that certain people are going to be more likely to be considered recidivism just because of who they live around. And the final one I'd bring up is output bias, which is the idea that who do you apply the model to, and how does the model get trained? So there's this famous example in Massachusetts of an app called Street Bump, which the city of Boston wanted to use to find out where the potholes were. So they built this app, they gave it to people, they drove around their cars and reported the bumps. Unfortunately, the people who were downloading the apps were all people who were techies and lived around urban areas. So pretty much it found all the potholes around Harvard and MIT.
How do you make sure that, I know we have a lot of diversity, equity within our hiring practices, but how do you make sure Informed is not creating models that are biased, or that they're all focused on engineers and techies that live and breathe this stuff? So what is your take on that?
I think that's a great question. And I think there's a lot of answers. From a process perspective, you have to really look at every part of the decision-making process. If you're making a hiring model, you have to have multiple stakeholders there who bring in different things. If you're looking at the data, make sure you have a diverse set of data. The other thing you want to do is when you actually run the models, there are now multiple types of models which can control for fairness. You can have a dual purpose, a gradient descent model, and one part's trying to solve the problem, the other one's trying to be fair. So at the end of the day, I'm an optimist. Yann LeCun, a Turing Award winner and one of the developers of machine learning, said, it's easier to remove bias in AI than in humans. And I think ultimately that's the case. So here, I wanted to turn it back to you, Jessica. You're a leading auto expert. And what are you hearing in the market about AI's impact on bias?
Yeah, so I think that from the perspective is that, change is a little scary. We heard a lot of feedback around ChatGPT, how are you using it? And I think from the perspective is that we all want to use these cool things, but we want to make sure that we're prepared and we have the right background to understand what AI is ultimately doing. I think one of the things that resonated with me when you were talking was the bias in data, right? So we've known historically that credit files reporting is really not ultimately the best data source. And so we've worked so hard to try to get all these different data sources. But I think the biggest part about is making sure that you have, a contributor database, you have millions and millions of different records so that you have truly an equitable and diverse population, like you mentioned, so that you can really make sure that within the auto industry, you're not just focusing on one segmentation, but you're looking at how to make sure that you're marketing to the right people, that expanding the market for people that are going to be good performers, and then also not hurting them if they have a thin file, or if their FICO credit score is not as high as others, just because they, like you said, historically, maybe their family didn't have a credit card to put them on their trade line. So I think those aspects are really critical on being transparent within the auto industry across the board.
You raised a really interesting point there. And one thing I wanted to also bring up is I think we're really in the early innings of a 9-inning game, using a baseball metaphor, with bias. Right now, we have technologies that can find bias. And I think some companies and some folks in the industry are worried, if I find bias, what am I supposed to do about it? But in fact, there are a lot of tools and technologies that can help you eliminate bias before it even starts. So I think we're going to see a shift from being afraid of the bias we found to actually recognizing that we can minimize bias by being proactive. So I'm so excited about the future. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think, you have to face change. You have to face anything that you're fearful of. So I think it's great that we really have this focus on it to increase the transparency. So, but with that, I think bye now. I appreciate all of your insights, Tom, as usual. And we want to hear from y'all. So if y'all have any additional insights or topics that you want to cover, let us know. And for that, stay informed.
Stay informed.